now concluded the Civil War era, and we are about to take a comparatively long leap into the future, from the 1870s to 1934, when President Franklin Roosevelt set about to rescue the United States of America from economic catastrophe by enacting the matrix of social programs that we remember as the New Deal, and then enrolled the USA in the global campaign to defeat Nazism, which concluded in 1945, the year that Franklin Roosevelt died. This is our third critical period in United States history. But before we go there, we have one last theme to explore in the Civil War era, a theme that may serve as a good transition point to our next critical period, the fate of Native Americans during the Civil War and afterwards, during the so-called Gilded Age period of the late 19th century. And at this point, I want to veer off from the master narrative of U.S. history and talk a little bit about the origins of the first peoples of North America. The standard approach in lecture classes like this is to talk about those origins at the beginning of the class and then move on and forget about those people. I'm putting the discussion in the middle here so that they stay in the narrative more prominently. I must confess that sometimes I do wonder how many of you still get taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Send me an email if you do, because it isn't true. Long before Columbus, the Americas had been discovered by Asians. These Asians mostly came from the northeastern area that today we call Siberia. They crossed the path we call the Bering Strait by land. North America and northeastern Asia were land connected back then. Very icy land it was, and they, hunters and fish gathering people, crossed it starting about 60,000 years ago and stopped migrating probably 15,000 years ago when the Ice Age ended and the strait turned into water. And they discovered America. We don't have or know of any particular Asian person who first said something like, hey, let's go over the Bering Strait and see what's on the other side. I can't give you a name. But they came here, and they were, for the most part, nomadic peoples, and probably they were following the food supply, woolly mammoths, giant bison, animals that provided meat and warmth. As they, the animals, became extinct, the peoples of the Americas began to develop agriculture, roughly around the same time that it was being developed in the so-called Near East, that is to say, Mesopotamia, that is to say, Iraq. This is around 9,000 years ago. From this point of departure, amazing civilizations sprung up across the Americas. Perhaps the most impressive of them all was that Aztec Empire of Mexico, whose capital, Tenochtitlan, was one of the biggest cities in the world, around 250,000 residents. Meanwhile, around 12 million people lived in the Inca Empire, in what we now call Peru. Like the Roman Empire, Inca civilization was held together by a vast network of roads and bridges. In North America, extensive civilization spread out across the continent. The mound builders of Louisiana created a kind of trade network of elevated cities overlooking the Mississippi River and Ohio River Valley. Thousands of people lived in these communities going back to 1200 BCE. In what is now Arizona, the Hopi and the Zuni nations built elaborate urban structures. They were kind of like apartment complexes. I mean, they didn't have Wi-Fi or cable, but they had dams and canals to distribute water. They were the biggest, tallest human-made things in North America until the 19th century. In eastern North America, a complex array of tribes lived on the lands from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Canada. They planted corn and squash and beans and hunted deer and turkeys who looked a lot like the turkeys that hang around my office at Stevenson College here at UC Santa Cruz. Every now and then I'm trying to park my car and there's a wild turkey standing in front of me and I think, nothing personal, but you look delicious. Well, they were tasty back then too. A lot of these tribes were small and they sometimes warred with each other, but in many instances they created leagues or confederations to bring peace. In the southeast, a trio of tribes, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Cherokee, created an alliance that ultimately extended to two more tribes, the Secoya and the Seminole, who became known in the early U.S. Republic as the Five Civilized Tribes. They embraced the English language, U.S.-style laws, and they published newspapers. In the New York, Pennsylvania region, five peoples created what became known as the Great League of Peace: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Onondaga. These groups of people were very diverse. They had different languages, different customs, different belief systems. There were, however, some commonalities to the experience of the pre-colonial era of indigenous people. They assigned great spiritual power to the natural world. They saw sacred spirits in the animals, the plants, the natural landscape around them, and in the cosmos. They sometimes prayed to the spirits of the animals they killed, asking forgiveness, or they prayed that the natural cycles of harvest and weather would favor them. The irony is that when Europeans arrived, they quickly concluded that the Indians needed to be converted to Christianity and rescued from their pagan ideas, when in fact a lot of Christianity seems to float historically over an array of pagan animist ideas. Now, there's a lot of pretty simplistic meme stuff on Facebook about this that basically goes something like the following. Christmas was more or less grafted out of winter solstice celebrations. Winter solstice is when the sun reaches its southernmost point and you get the longest night of the year, usually in late December. Ancient pagans, the Druids and those kind of folks, sought to encourage the return of the sun by planting green trees in the middle of winter. Sound familiar? So the Easter holiday has its roots in the Mesopotamian worship of the fertility goddess Ishtar, whose sacred symbols were, yes, eggs and rabbits. And her son, Ishtar's son, Tammuz, died each year, but then rose from the dead, just like spring resurrects from the landscape from winter. This stuff is very simplistic, and the eggs and the rabbits thing is probably just plain wrong. But I still think that much of the Judean-Christian holiday system evolved over prior rituals that marked the seasons and recognized the importance of fertility and natural regeneration. The other similarity that most native peoples had with each other was their attitudes about property. Our contemporary ideas about ownership of land did not exist for them. Families had the right to use land, but it was not regarded as permanently theirs. Indians saw land as a common resource. As long as a community cultivated land and took care of it, they had the right to the soil. The whole idea of fencing off land and calling it mine, not yours, they didn't have a sense of this. Because of this, because men did not own land, women often had more political power in native societies. While men hunted and fished, women cultivated the land and owned dwellings and tools. A husband traditionally moved into the family of his wife, not the other way around. So women often functioned as tribal elders, attending important meetings and selecting tribal leaders. Despite all these commonalities, the native peoples of North America did not experience themselves as one group of people. Their differences were considerable, especially in terms of language. So that when Europeans arrived, they did not see Europeans as dramatically new. Many simply regarded them as a new group and tried to figure out how they would relate to them and perhaps better themselves in some kind of alliance with them. The whole concept of Indian identity versus European identity now began to emerge in the years just prior to the American Revolution. Prior to the French and Indian War, which we studied earlier, native tribes were able to play the French and British off against each other. They were able to establish zones of independence in which they were largely autonomous of both empires. But once the British completely took over, it was clear that the British colonists would gradually move in on indigenous lands unless they were stopped. And so a group of tribes, the Ottawa and the Hurons, launched an offensive called Pontiac's Rebellion. We've talked about that event already. Their leaders articulated one of the first visions of pan-Indian identity, that all indigenous peoples in North America had a common identity and a common enemy, the Europeans, and only through cooperation with each other could they protect their lands and independence. Pontiac was an Ottawa war leader, and he made a famous speech quoted in your Voices, reader, and I'll read it to you. Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none. Your nation supposes that we, like the white people, cannot live without bread and pork and beef. But you ought to know that He, the Great Spirit and Master of life, has provided food for us in these spacious lakes and on these woody mountains. And then Pontiac's army launched attacks on hundreds of white settlers who had tried to take over Indian lands. In response, the British quickly counterattacked. But the British Crown also issued a royal proclamation, what we today would experience as a kind of executive order coming from the president, perhaps. It barred white colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The point of this was to stabilize relationships with the various indigenous groups around the Appalachians and the Ohio Valley. The British and the French Empire military had served in various waves as buffers between First Nation peoples and the colonists. Their disappearance eliminated that buffer, and between the American Revolution and the War of 1812, more and more First Nation people lost their land. The Civil War also had a big impact on Western Indians. One of the first orders that Lincoln made as president was to take away federal troops from the Western USA, so that they could guard Washington, D.C. Indian leaders came to Washington, D.C. and pleaded with Lincoln to reverse this decision, because those troops were often the only barrier between Indians and the whites who wanted to move onto Indian land. The result was, predictably, that whites encroached on Indian land. In Minnesota, terrible skirmishes took place between white settlers and Sioux Indians. They were really all-out battles in which the Sioux killed hundreds of white farmers before the U.S. Army sent off a division westward to stop the fighting. Then a military court sentenced 300 Indians to death. President Lincoln commuted most of them, but 38 Indians were still executed. This representing to this day the biggest official execution in United States history. 2 years later, in November of 1864, a terrible massacre of Indians took place in Sand Creek, Colorado. It was led, ironically, by an abolitionist named John Chivington. Chivington was originally a Methodist minister. As a minister, he served in frontier missions in Illinois and Kansas. He was contemptuous of slavery. Eventually, his anti-slavery sermons got him threatened by some congregants. He showed up for the next Sunday sermon with 2 guns in hand, and he declared, "By the grace of God and these revolvers, I'm going to preach here today." This made him famous. People started calling him the Fighting Parson. When the Civil War broke out, Chivington resigned his position in the church and took a commission as a major in a Colorado regiment. And he became a hero of the Battle of Glorieta Pass in eastern New Mexico. His troops famously rappelled down a cliff to get at a Confederate enemy supply train. After the war, Chivington became politically ambitious. That meant dealing with the Cheyenne. A Denver newspaper advocated, quote, the extermination of the Red Devils, and urged readers to, quote, take a few months off and dedicate that time to wiping out the Indians. Chivington took this advice, stating that, quote, it is simply not possible for Indians to obey or even understand any treaty. I am fully satisfied, gentlemen, that to kill them is the only way we will ever have peace and quiet in Colorado. During the early morning hours of November 29, 1864, Chivington led a regiment of Colorado volunteers to the Cheyenne's Sand Creek Reservation, where a band led by Black Kettle, a well-known peace chief, was encamped. Federal Army officers had promised Black Kettle safety if he would return to the reservation. He was, in fact, flying the American flag and a white flag of truce over his lodge, but Jivington ordered an attack on the unsuspecting village nonetheless, then murdered from 100 to 400 Cheyenne, many of them children. After the slaughter, his troops scalped and sexually mutilated many of the bodies, later exhibiting their trophies to cheering crowds in Denver. Congress was appalled. A woman named Helen Hunt Jackson wrote a book called Century of Dishonor, detailing the horror. Congressional investigations took place. Promises of reparations to the Indians were even made. But throughout the Civil War, a war between the Union Army and various Native American tribes ensued. Conflicts with the Kiowas, with the Comanches, and with the Navajo, in which Union forces led by the famous Indian fighter Kit Carson forced 8,000 people to move to a reservation in New Mexico. The Navajo came to call this forced removal the Long Walk. It was similar in some ways to the terrible Trail of Tears of the 1830s, in which 5 eastern tribes were forced to migrate to the Oklahoma Territory. But in the case of the Navajo, they were allowed to return to their original lands in Colorado. Interestingly, as your textbook notes, the Confederacy in many ways treated Native Americans more sympathetically than the Union. Indian tribes could elect representatives to the Confederate Congress. The administration of Confederate President Jefferson Davis allowed Native tribes self-government. And some tribes, such as the Cherokee, that still remained in the South, sided with the Confederacy, since some Cherokee owned slaves. But after the war, relations between the United States and various Native tribes only got worse. Following the war, the Transcontinental Railroad incorporated the West into the national economy and disrupted the lives of the Plains Indians across the region. In 1868, the nation elected General Ulysses S. Grant as president, and he announced a new peace policy, as he called it, in the West. But the vast army of Western settlers rendered this initiative useless. Among their most famous habits was the hunting of buffalo, which made this staple for the Plains Indians all but extinct. Railroad passengers liked to shoot at the buffalo from their window seats. In 1886, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. went west to see if any buffalo still existed. They could barely find 25. Sioux leader Sitting Bull famously declared that, quote, "A cold wind blew across the prairie when the last buffalo fell, a death wind for my people." Seemingly endless wars with the federal government now ensued. These included a 1,700-mile chase to capture the Nez Perce Indians from Oregon and remove them to Oklahoma. They also included a famous battle between Native American occupants of the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory and General George C. Custer, in which Custer underestimated his Sioux and Cheyenne opponents, and his entire command of 250 men died as a consequence. This was the Battle of Little Bighorn, but it only put off the continued marginalization of Native Americans during the late 19th century, the conquest of the Sioux, the Apache, and the entire Comanche Empire. What to do with these subjugated peoples, the federal government pondered. The objective now became to decimate Native American culture. A Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs set up boarding schools where Indian children were, when possible, separated from their parents, given new names, and taught white Christian ways. The Dawes Act of 1877 was passed, named after Henry Dawes of Massachusetts. The act broke up the communally shared land of nearly all tribes into small parcels, sellable and buyable by white people. Indians who accepted this and, quote, adopted the habits of civilized life, end of quote, would become American citizens. "Kill the Indian," declared Dawes, "to save the man." The Dawes Act was a disaster for Indians. When the federal government made 2 million acres of Indian land available in Oklahoma, 50,000 white settlers poured into the territory to claim farms on one single day, April 22, 1889. In the 50 years following the Dawes Act, Indians lost 86 million of the 138 million acres of land they owned in 1887. Various historians have tried to estimate how much land Native Americans lost between 1776 and today, and they estimate an area around 25 times the size of Great Britain. That is, 25 times the size of England and Scotland and Wales. U.S. leaders defended these policies, insisting that by trading in their own ways, Indians would reap the benefits of American citizenship. But most Native Americans did not want to become American citizens. Most Native Americans wanted to remain who they were. They wanted to keep their tribal identities. Those who actually tried to take the trade in found that they faced massive discrimination from white society and a court system that did not defend their rights as American citizens, even questioned whether they could ever really assimilate. Nonetheless, in 1924, Congress made all Indian Americans citizens, whether they wanted to be or not. In the midst of all this pain, some Indians took spiritual refuge in something called the ghost dance. It was a messianic movement advocated by a Paiute Indian named Wovoka, who had been brought up believing that a new world was in the offing, one in which all the whites of the world would be swallowed up by the earth somehow. The ghosts of dead Indians would come back to life and everyone would achieve immortality. To achieve this, Indians needed to dance the ghost dance, Wovoka's father taught him. But the son, who had been adopted by a white family, modified this set of spiritual ideas. Influenced by Christianity, he de-emphasized the ideas that whites would die and foregrounded the idea that the dance would promote Indian unity and survival. As time went on, the ghost dance became to indigenous peoples whatever they wanted it to be, just like pretty much every religion, right? To some it became a solace, a way to live out one's life in the legacy of conquest. To others it became a means of empowerment. Some continued to believe that the dance would usher in a world without white people, or that it would protect them from bullets. When Sitting Bull famously endorsed the ghost dance, he destroyed a peace pipe before his audience and made a militant speech. But the bottom line about the ghost dance was that it was a dance. It was like about people dancing. This minor detail apparently escaped the thinking of one Major James McLaughlin, who in his capacity as an Indian agent fired off a memo to the Bureau of Indian Affairs warning that there was no telling what Sitting Bull would do next now that he was going around ghost dancing and stuff. This letter was leaked to prominent newspapers who sounded the alarm of an impending conspiracy to wipe out white people everywhere. The next thing you knew, President Benjamin Harrison sent troops to South Dakota who botched an attempted arrest of Sitting Bull by killing him and some of his associates and getting a few of themselves killed to boot. Next, they caught up with a big portion of Sitting Bull's Hunkpapa tribe on December 15, 1890, who had fled the area because they were scared, justly so it seems, as Harrison's troops let them have it on December 28th in a spot called Wounded Knee Creek. Something like 180 Indians died, 18 children among them, and with that, the historian Jesse Walker writes, the great dancing conspiracy was put down, its legacy known to this day as the Wounded Knee Massacre. The Wounded Knee Massacre marked the low point in the history of Native Americans in the USA. By 1900, it is estimated that the Indian population had fallen to 250,000 people. This because of conquest and, to a large extent, also because of exposure to European diseases for which indigenous peoples had no immunity. A children's book about Indians published during this time flatly stated, and I quote, "The Indian pictured in these pages no longer exists." And yet, what is remarkable about the 20th century is the resurgence of indigenous peoples, a story that we will explore soon. And that, interestingly, begins in some ways with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which included a New Deal for Native Americans. We'll talk about America's transition from the late 19th century to the modernity of the 20th century in our next lecture.